a girl in Africa means navigating a journey marked by many hurdles. Here are 4 challenges that women and girls in Africa face every single day. 1. Period poverty. Millions of girls across the continent do not have access to menstrual hygiene information, products, or even toilets. Those who do have access often cannot afford it. Women in 9 countries across the continent earning minimum wage have to spend 13% of their salaries on sanitary products. 2. FGM. The practice of cutting or removing female genitalia for non-medical reasons affects 200 million women worldwide and is still practiced across the continent. Roughly 44,000 women and girls die each year from this practice. 3. Access to education. Thousands of schools across the continent have closed because of insecurity and conflict, depriving at least 2.5 million children of education, most of them girls. And 4. Gender-based violence. Up to 51% of girls under the age of 18 experience sexual violence in Malawi, Nigeria, Uganda, and Zambia, with sexual violence being highly prevalent in conflict zones. What's more is that women and girls with disabilities are estimated to be 10 times more likely to experience sexual violence. Despite these challenges, women and girls on the continent continue to do the most amazing things. They are resilient forces of beauty, greatness, and wisdom. That's why every girl, everywhere, deserves a chance to thrive and why we should continue to push for gender equality.
Did you know 8,000 underage children are married in California each year? That's crazy, right? And globally, 12 million girls are married before they reach the age of 18. That's 28 girls every minute. Child marriage is a heartbreaking reality that continues to affect millions of girls worldwide, even within the USA. It is a violation of human rights, mainly impacting young girls and their futures, including California, which still lacks comprehensive legislation. Global citizens, we need your help putting an end to child marriage for once and all. I am a child marriage survivor. I was coerced into a marriage at the age of 16 to a man much older than me. I finally left my abusive child marriage when my sister Banaz, also a child bride, was murdered in a so-called honor killing. She paid the ultimate price for leaving her child marriage. And I want to ensure that no other girl has the same experiences as me or my sister. Follow the link below to leave a personal message for Governor Newsom of California and ask him to step up efforts to prevent child marriage for people under the age of 18. Together we can end child marriage for once and all.
This particular treaty is a matter of life to us. So I'm here to represent the voices of West Speakers in Kenya. INC4 is one of the biggest platforms that the realities of West Speakers, these are the communities that are working at the very forefront of this justice crisis. One thing that we've been very much pursuing in the INC is a just transition, particularly to West Speakers, because West Speakers are working at the very front line of the situation, the pollution, the plastic crisis. We work in situations where pollution that is brought about by this situation is at a very speedy way killing West Speakers. We are the people that have been working for years and decades in solving this situation, so our voices has to be incorporated in this policy-making platform.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the third Global Town Hall session is on the promise of universality, a North-South debate on how to promote and protect human rights for all. The session will be moderated by TV presenter and producer Violeta Ngina. Violeta, you may have the floor.
Hello.
Hello.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Great. So allow me to officially welcome all of you again to the third session of the Global Town Hall 2024 on this 7th day of September. It is a collaboration between Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and Global Citizen. My name is Violet again. I'm a television presenter from Kenya, and I'm very excited to be with all of you in this town hall. Our topic, as you have had, is the promise of universality, how to promote and also how we can protect human rights for every single one of us. And that is a very important conversation that we need to be having as a globe right now. Our speakers for this session, we are honored to be joined by Irene J. Liu, who is a Regional Director, Asia and the Pacific at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. We also do have Ingeborg Moore, who is the Executive Director of Norwegian Human Rights Fund. We also do have with us Sandra Kremer, who is the Chair of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. And finally, we have Olivia Baimukendole, who is the public interest environmental lawyer. I'm very certain with the speakers that we do have in this station, we're going to be able to have a very fruitful conversation on how to protect human rights for everyone. So I'm just going to jump straight into the conversations. And the first speaker who will be talking to us is Irene J. Liu. Good morning and thank you for being with us. And just to kick off the conversation, we'd like for you to paint a picture for us on how freedom of speech is perceived and also implemented in the global north and in the global south as well, given that these two regions do have different cultural practices, different political backgrounds. How do these two elements affect the implementation and also the perception of freedom of speech?
Thanks, Violetta. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that when it comes to freedom of expression and freedom of speech, the division is not necessarily global north versus global south. I think that it is highly culturally specific. And what we see is that it really depends on the plurality of the population, the diversity of religion and culture, race and others, and also the history of the democracy, the country, and the cultural context around that. And so to be specific on that, I think, to me, what I see often is the difference between definition of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. In a place such as America, you would see that freedom of speech is really about being able to say anything you want at any time to anyone in whichever platform you want. And I think in other cultures and contexts, it's really about the freedom to speak and to express yourself without harassment. And I think that that's where you really see a difference when it comes to the expectations of how policy can help to sort of guide this sphere, the pressures and the discussions around the obligations of tech platforms to monitor speech, to fight and block misinformation and disinformation. And I think, but would like to say that I think that when it comes to one aspect of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, which is journalism, the act of committing journalistic acts, this is very much an economic question. The model for journalism has radically shifted and quite frankly crumbled over the past few decades, and it was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can't do journalism without resources, legal protections, physical protections, and institutions to actually support that very, very difficult work. And a lot of that costs money. And so when you don't have the resources to support that business model that enable free and independent journalism, when organizations must rely heavily on government advertising, business interests, or others, it becomes difficult to do journalism. And so that is a really, really important factor in ensuring that you do have freedom of the press, freedom of journalism. You have access for individual people to easily and readily access high quality information. And so addressing the question of the business model and the economics around journalism become incredibly important. Thank you.
All right, now just before we move to our next speaker, who's going to be Ingeborg, I'd like for you to help us understand, are there limits to how far freedom of speech can go, and what will it take for everyone, regardless of where you are in the world, to enjoy the aspects of freedom of speech?
It's such an interesting question. I think that what we can say is that it is quite specific to each country in terms of the norms that are required, what types of restraints are needed from a legal standpoint. For example, we have seen that in many countries where there is a great deal of diversity and there's a fear of kind of discontent and disharmony in society as a result of cultural differences, there may be efforts to constrain certain types of hate speech and other pieces, right? So even in a place like Germany, you can see that Holocaust denial is not legally allowed, and also there are concerns and discussions about that from a legal framework and a policy framework in many different countries. And then meanwhile, in other contexts, the idea is that freedom of speech must be protected at all costs, even if it means that people can say things that are offensive or hurtful or harmful to others. And so then that, as a result, the reliance becomes and the pressure becomes on individual people, platforms, the places where people gather to have freedom of speech or to discuss, where that is the pressure is for those spaces to then be monitored, which of course, in any place when there are constraints on speech, it's a fine balance to enable people to speak freely without fear, or to, on the other hand, to allow mechanisms, especially when it comes to policy, to overreach and to constrain speech. And so I think that in every country, in every context, this tension is a real one. And it's not a global north versus a global south issue. This is a debate and a constant tension that exists in every society all around the world at every moment.
All right. Thank you so very much, Irene, for making that very clear for us. We'll definitely come back to you for more. However, for now, we move to Ingeborg Moore, who is the Executive Director of the Norwegian Human Rights Fund. And the first question I do have for you is, we'd like to understand a lot more on how you perceive the growing scrutiny of human rights violations in the Western countries. Particularly, we're talking about racial and ethnic discrimination, refugee and migrant rights, and also economic inequalities. Over to you.
Thank you, Violetta. I think that to me, coherence is the key word here. And that this is where many Western governments are failing right now. Because if we say that human rights are universal, we really need to show that we mean it. And we need to show that we mean that through our actions and through countries' foreign policies. So we need to treat human rights abuses as exactly that, regardless of whether they're now taking place here in Europe, massively in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Palestine, or within the borders of our own countries, or as you were referring to, not to speak of at the border of our own countries. And that said, I would say also there's a lot of hope and empowerment in seeing that also in, let's say, the West/global North, large parts of the population seem to understand this and go out in the streets to protest whether those human rights abuses are taking place in our neighborhood in Ukraine, in Sudan, or in Gaza. There is a difference, though, in how it's being perceived or accepted, in that we see that politicians from across the spectrum, rightly so, put their support behind human rights for the Ukrainian people, while we're seeing increasingly a different approach to legitimate protest of what is happening in Palestine, where authorities and institutions are sanctioning those who are voicing support of human rights in Palestine. And then perhaps lastly to say that I think it's important that in the same way as we need to scrutinize how the effects of colonialism still manifests in our world, in terms of its legacy being, as you were saying, racism, inequality, discrimination, we in the West also need to come to terms with the fact that we practiced colonialism and massive discrimination within our own countries. And we need to be willing to look closely at the legacy of that and how we can both remedy past abuses and change our policies and mindset in order not to commit new human rights abuses. And I'd like to just end with using my own country, Norway, as an example. So last year, we're talking 2023, for 37 hours on the public TV broadcaster, artists and politicians read aloud from the final report of Norway's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This Truth and Reconciliation Commission report provided a detailed history of Norway's century-long policy of Norwegianization or forced assimilation that targeted the indigenous Sami people and other linguistic minorities into the 1960s, and where its repercussions are seen even today. And the subject matter of that was dark. It was forced relocations, it was racial abuse, it was languages and heritage lost. And so I think that also within our own countries, we need to do the things we're doing internationally, ensure access to justice, remedy for past human rights violations, work against impunity, do what we can to reduce inequality.
All right. Now, moving forward, for the sake of the generation that is to come, for the sake of better days ahead, what do you think needs to be done by every single party involved to make sure that we are addressing these issues to the core?
I think that, and this kind of links to what we are doing at the Norwegian Human Rights Fund as well, because we work internationally and not so much focused on Norway. But what needs to be done is really the same. It's perhaps firstly talking about protecting the public and their right to protest, to ensure that we protect human rights defenders and their right to defend rights wherever they are, to work against impunity, to work for ensuring access to justice and remedy for past human rights violations, and also to do what we can to reduce inequality that's behind a lot of this, a driving force, discrimination, and any forms of marginalization. So I think that the recipe, to put it that way, is the same, whether we are working in solidarity with people elsewhere or whether we are working within our own countries.
All right. Thank you so very much, Ingeborg, for that recipe on what we need to do for the future. We'll come back to you for more, but for now, let us move to Sandra Krimer, our next speaker of the day, who is the chair of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. Now, we want to talk a lot more on the indigenous community, who make about 6.2% of the world's population, yet they do suffer a wide range of issues. Sandra, since you are in that space, you have interacted with them, kindly help us understand what are some of the most pressing issues that are faced by the indigenous people in the world?
Yes, thank you. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional land that I'm on at the moment. I'm on Durumba country, and we always, as Indigenous peoples, give acknowledgement to wherever we're meeting at. I'm with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, and our work is that we're a global Indigenous organisation. We work to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples defenders, and we try and unite and amplify the call for justice and respect for Indigenous peoples' rights. And one of the biggest things is that our cultural rights are violated, because in my role and in the role of IPRI, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, we work with Indigenous human rights defenders who are protecting their land. And as we know, for us as Indigenous people, we are here for the next 7th generation. We understand our cultural rights, that we're only passing through this time. So our role mainly is to care for Mother Earth. We are the stewardships that are here to protect the land, protect the water, to make sure there's clean water, air, and also to make sure that we continue to have life as peoples on this earth. But our rights are continually violated as Indigenous peoples around the world. When we protest not for funds. We don't protest for that, but we protest to protect the land. We protest to protect the seas, the land, the air, everything that is related to us. But we are seen as criminals, and we are treated like criminals. We are incarcerated continually around the globe. We are always violated on our rights, even freedom of speech, because people, and in regards to this, is that we're up against a lot of corporations, we're up against mines, we're up against governments who want to continue to rape the land for the jewels that we know that is there for their own benefits. And when you're up against large corporations, when you have a lot of funding, when you have a lot of government backing, when you have bank backings, it's all about money. But for us, we are here to continue to make sure that we protect. And in IPRI, what we do is we provide small grants, we receive donations, we work with people around the world to make sure that they have legal assistance in the courts, because we do have a lot of killings. People are not aware of how many killings there are for Indigenous peoples when it comes to protect our land, when it comes to speaking out in any of the big United Nations meetings or anything like that. We're continually harassed, we're intimidated. If we speak out, some organisations, some countries are not funding Indigenous peoples to have a voice. And, there's so much violations against us. And it's, and I can speak with truth with this, when I've sat at the table of many tables around the world, people do not understand who Indigenous peoples are. They don't understand our culture. They don't understand even what we're talking about. And it's, like I said, our rights are violated. We have had so many different legislations and policies to continually try to hold us down, and to continually, with human movement of our lands, taking, we have a large number of Indigenous people who are continually forced off their lands, who are continually, their food is and their crops and their trees are continually being ruined, where they can't eat, where they can't have their traditional food. And it's, this is a voice for people here to understand us as Indigenous people, what our rights are, what our cultural rights are. Our cultural rights are, we are the stewardships. We have our Dreamtime stories. We have our songlines that connect us to our Mother Earth. But we're not criminals. And this is this point that people have to understand. Human rights, cultural rights as well, walk hand in hand for us as Indigenous peoples.
Right. Thank you so very much, Sandra, for making it very clear for everyone in this session to understand the challenges that the Indigenous communities face. And it's quite sad to hear about being treated like criminals, and the killings and the harassment and oppression. But that is why we're here, to make sure that we come up with ways and discuss how we can make the world better for the Indigenous communities. And I'd like for you to share with us on what you think the international legal framework, what can be done in that space, how can it be strengthened to make sure that it's representing the Indigenous communities better?
Well, that's a difficult one, but one of the things is that as Indigenous people, we continually go to the United Nations to voice our opinion when we have the expert mechanisms, the permanent forum meetings in New York. But the thing is that even though there are treaties in place, there are those international mechanisms in place, when they come down to the national level or local levels in people's communities, it's all watered down. We here in Australia, for example, we have people who are continually 29 years in courts trying to fight for recognition of their land, that they were the traditional owners of this land. This is happening everywhere around. And so the legal system, I think, even the international arena for the treaties and the UN mechanisms, they need to continually change, because one of the issues that I want to quickly raise is that climate change refugees, when it comes to Indigenous people. There was a case out in New Zealand where Kirby Island people went because the sea is taking up the land. They went to New Zealand to try and see if they could become climate change refugees. It was one of the first cases in the High Court over in New Zealand. they were declined. They had to go back to their island where the water is rising, which is a sad thing. So, you know, when you're not recognised as a climate change refugee in the world, where we have many in the Pacific where I live, where the water is rising and people are continually having to leave their islands that they have lived on from generations to generations, and that there's nowhere that they're considered. You know, we know that in the international arena, refugees is if you're going to be persecuted if you go home, but it's not for us as Indigenous people when it comes to us as climate change. So, you know, there has to be a lot starting from the top and has to be a lot put in the national and in the local levels in the law. And it's a very hard system. But you know what? I always say to people, we're going to win some and we're going to lose some. We have to continue battling in those courts and to make changes and to give recognition to us as Indigenous people and also to make the wrongs right.
Thank you so very much, Sandra, for that. We'll come back to you to speak about what your organization is currently doing to fill in the gaps when it comes to fighting for the human rights of the Indigenous communities. And I believe every single person in this session is rallying behind the Indigenous communities as well. Now, I want to move to our next speaker of the session, Mr. Olivier Ndole. I believe he finally made to join us. Thank you so much for being here. And he is a public interest environmental lawyer, which is a very important docket given that now in the wake of climate change and environmental degradation, a lot of people are coming out to speak for the environment, to fight for the environment, to conserve our environment. But according to a report, Global Witness in 2021, 200 people, environmental defenders, were killed. However, there has been efforts to address this challenge, such as the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. Mr. Olivier, I'd like to hear your thoughts, how you feel about that report, what that makes you feel, given that you are a public interest environmental lawyer, and also these efforts that have been put in place, like the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. So far, have they been effective in our journey?
Yeah, I want first to say thank you for you and for Global Citizen to make a kind of those initiatives, because you know are the forgotten defender, the environment defender in the past. It was very difficult to find some place on which we can speak about our situation. Yeah, I'm so sorry, you know, I speak French, but I will use English. You know, that report and those initiatives which you are doing for us, it's a kind of hope which we have, like, you know, in the past, many, like a thousand peasants who are fighting about, you know, the environment, about climate change was killed, and the other was being arrested, and some of them, even today in my country, they are in prison because they are fighting about environment. They are fighting about protected area. They are fighting about clean water. They are fighting about just transition energy. And this Global Witness report for us, yes, it's very painful, those information which are inside that report. But for us, we can't say that is very painful, but it's between, you know, painful movement and the situation, but also the hope and the successful movement which environment defender they care on their, you know, on their head to support their right to say what they need and to push their voice to international level. And those initiatives, I think that they are like the successful movement and the justice which want to give to environment defender. You know, even if in my country, this 6 year, this 6 month past, we had a report about, you know, the situation of environment defender. We had more than 20 cases for environment defender. In those 20 cases, 6 environment defender was killed. And that it's continue to add on that list which global witness made and put to public space. But for us, we can't say that because the situation is very highly risk to stop our fight. But we are speak that situation, and we can add and ask the solidarity on international level to support those 100,000 environment defender on the field. So the situation, yes, is very bad, but which we have to say, we are very happy because now we can speak in a kind of those room to give the voice of local defenders, to ask for the solidarity, to ask for more reform which support the freedom, the right of life for environment defender. And we are thinking that our work, our job is very important for this world. It's very important for all of you. And we can't fight about how to save environment, how to save forest without environment defender. And we must know that we must support environment defender on the field.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Olivier. But very quickly, please help us understand what makes one an environmental defender.
What?
What
Can
makes...
you repeat?
All right, I'll take that one more time. Can you hear me now? Are you okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. So we just want to understand broadly what makes someone become an environmental defender. Can you hear me? All right, I think we're having a bit of a technical issue with Mr. Olivier, but
it's very difficult because the network, but citizens, they are fighting about environmental rights because like my country, it's the country which we can say that in the future about climate change, because we have the second forest in the world, the transition energy about those critical mining. We have the more percent about those mining, and about those issues.
Mr. Olivier, I think we're having a bit of a technical issue. Maybe we can
a good plan and a good policy about how to deal with those critical mining. It's a big challenge because
all right, at this particular moment, as Mr. Olivier tries to sort out the internet issues on his end, we can continue with the conversation with Irene. And at this juncture, we'd like to understand a lot more on the International Fund for Public Access Media, which you represent. Please tell us more about the impacts that the fund is having, particularly for your grantees in the Global South, and what your goals are for your upcoming new business case launch. Talk to us about that.
Sure, thank you. So the International Fund for Public Interest Media was launched last year at World Press Freedom Day. And we really, our intention as a multilateral fund is to support public interest, independent media in the Global South. As I mentioned before, a lot of the challenges facing journalism are economic challenges at the core, in addition to of course, the legal and political frameworks that journalists operate in many countries. But we are trying as much as possible to try to tackle the foundational economic challenges and the business case relating to how to ensure that journalism can thrive. Journalism is a human endeavor. It requires salaries. It requires protection. It requires the ability to amplify and distribute the information that is produced, and all of that comes at an economic cost. We know that the business model for journalism is very challenging now, especially as advertising broadly has shrunk, and digital advertising in particular is just, it doesn't make as much money as print advertising used to. And more importantly, also, audiences have moved on. Journalism is competing with entertainment, and all kinds of other media that's out there. And who is trusted and who is authoritative also becomes a challenge. So for the International Fund, there are a whole host of issues that we could tackle. We believe that by providing grants and funding to media, that it enables these organizations to not only think about the survival of their operations and their work on a day-to-day basis now, but hopefully gives the opportunity and the runway to really think about how news organizations will do their work into the future so that journalism can thrive, that in high quality information that people need for their daily lives, they can access freely, and be confident that it's information that they can use to make decisions in the most important moments in their life. And
Right.
we've been in for about 2 years. We're about to launch our investment case to basically take this to the next level. The need is so great. The economic conditions are not, and the business model for news is not going to change. And we believe that journalism is a public good and that everyone has a responsibility to contribute to ensuring that it thrives.
All right. Thank you so very much. I want to open the floor to the discussants, so prepare your questions. But as you do that very quickly, Ingeborg Moore, I just want you to talk to us about the Norwegian Human Rights Fund is working with the city of Oslo on a very impactful project called Oslo as a Breathing Space City. Please tell us more about this special project, and then we move straight to our discussants.
Thanks so much, Violetta. I'll be very brief, but I want to take this opportunity to share with you that we are working with the city of Oslo, the municipality of Oslo, on something that I think is very important, namely taking care of ourselves as human rights defenders and environmental rights defenders. So to me, I think what they say on the planes, in the case of an emergency, put your mask on first before helping others. And this program is a part of that. It's a part of giving human rights defenders a breathing space. They come to Oslo for a time of 3 months. They get a program where they get psychological support, coaching, digital security training, but also the time to just be, to just breathe, regenerate, and return home with a sense of motivation and a feeling of solidarity to continue their work. And I want to take this opportunity to also encourage other cities around the world. It's also important that this takes place both, I think, in Global North, Global South, to establish such programs. We have a really good experience with this, and I think it's important to give human rights defenders also some breathing space. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so very much to our speakers for that first round of questions and answers. You have expounded broadly on human rights in the different regions and what we need to do moving forward. But now let us hear from our discussants. We have Professor Veselin, Nabib, Yusuf, and Maria. We can start with Professor.
Yes, thank you very much to all speakers, and it was wonderful presentation. Thank you for delivering those to us, but also thank you for all daily work you are doing on human rights. Really impressive. I have few points in which will touch upon several of the expressed opinions. One is to start with the universality and north to south debate. And I fully support what Irene said, that in fact, issues are always everywhere there. There are issues of differences, similarities, and they are not clearly divided north and south. In fact, universality doesn't come, Universal Declaration is universal not because it was written by some Westerners in 1948. It is universal because historically human rights emerged in every village in the world, all over the world. So they are universal by origin. And what the Universal Declaration did was not somehow to say that the Western are the best in respecting and protecting human rights. Absolutely the opposite. Those Westerners who wrote the Universal Declaration did it not because they are proud. They did it because they feel the guilt of the West for centuries of slavery, colonialism, exploitation, and all of that. So it's very important to remind that human rights are universal for everybody. They are not created by the American Constitution or the French Declaration du droit de l'homme and then exported somehow to the South. And Irene also very well explained the limit of the freedom of expression, which is important. That right is not absolute. One of the few rights that are not absolute are the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, exactly because they can also violate human rights. So human rights are respected to the point when they do not affect other human rights. We know, for example, the Rwandan genocide and the incitement of genocide being spread by the radio Milcolin. So the right of the freedom of expression should stop when it incites violence, when it incites genocide and other crimes. Moving to what Ingeborg beautifully said is that how important is consistency, how important is to treat every issue equally and not to leave anyone behind, how important is to pay attention to every single violation in the same way and not to over-focus on one situation and undermine another situation. And obviously, as she and others said, important for the Western country also to open their eyes and not to be complacent. There are issues of migrants and refugees and economic inequality and racism, in fact, systemic racism in most of the Western institutions. And this needs to be properly addressed because there is a lot of homophobia, there is a lot of xenophobia, and fake news. Back to the point Irene was making about freedom of expression, the role of the journalists is crucial in time where there is so much fake news, when the right of freedom of expression and the right to information should also go hand in hand with the right to know the truth. In social media, we see a lot of spread of misinformation, disinformation, fake news. And it's important for all of us as human rights defenders to point to what is wrong and to what is right. And obviously, yes, indigenous people and environmental issues are important because we see how long it takes for some of the human rights to be protected. It's a long battle. And not only on those, how long it took for women's rights to be recognized, a century. It's really not easy. It takes long time. And that's why it's important to do the daily work. And as you pointed very correctly, Sandra and Olivia, it's not only the legal work, it's not only the courts. Courts can take tens of years to satisfy an individual violation. And this is where it comes to campaign and empowerment and education. Human rights are not only protected in legal terms by filing cases and expecting judges to rule in favor, which I don't demand. It's an important work. Lawyers should do that. But equally, it's important to have massive, large campaign to name and shame, to protest, and to emphasize issues. And in addition to that, it is important to educate what we say human capabilities in addition to human rights. We need to bring the knowledge of human rights to every single person in the world, not to wait for the violations and then to approach governments and to approach the judiciary, rather to educate people so that they understand their rights and they build their own resilience, their own capabilities to defend those rights. That's for the moment what I wanted to say. Thank you all. It was amazing.
Thank you so much. We're going to move straight to Nabib. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for giving me this floor for this really good conversation by the speakers. They have presented a really good insights about the human rights, about the journalism, about the indigenous communities. And I really appreciated all those insights they have put in front of us. I would like to say about that, about the human rights, that the discourse surrounding human rights has been often been framed as universal, emphasizing inalienable rights that apply to all individuals, regardless of nationality, culture, or socioeconomic status. However, this North-South divide introduces significant complexities into this conversation, particularly when it comes to the ethicality or application of these rights across the vastly different geopolitical context. The historical legacy of colonialism plays a pivotal role in shaping this divide. The global north, largely composed of industrialized and economically dominant countries, has historically positioned itself as the standard bearer of human rights, often emphasizing civil and political liberties such as freedom of speech, democratic governance, and individual autonomy. These rights, largely born from Enlightenment values, align with the political evolution of northern societies. Whereas the global south, comprising countries that have been subject to colonial exploitation, economic dependency, and political instability, often prioritizes collective socioeconomic rights, including access to education, healthcare, and equitable distribution of resources. So this dichotomy raises critical questions about the universality of human rights. Are these rights truly universal, or are they shaped by the cultural and political histories of the global north? Moreover, when nations of global north advocate for the enforcement of specific human rights frameworks, particularly through mechanisms like economic coercion or political pressure, it often resembles a form of neo-imperialism. The power dynamics at play create a situation where southern nations are subject to northern interpretation of rights, potentially undermining the sovereignty and cultural autonomy. So, moreover, we must also grapple with the ethical implication of these power imbalances. The North's ability to impose punitive measures in the name of human rights often raises concerns about the selective enforcements of these rights. For instance, when economic sanctions are levied against a southern nation for human rights abuses, the unintended consequences often exacerbate poverty and suffering among the very population these measures were meant to be. So this calls the question about the ethical validity of such actions. Are we upholding the human rights, or are we reinforcing global inequalities under the guise of moral righteousness? So I would like to end my discussion about the ethicality or the application regarding the human rights, that there's a discrimination what the North experiences and what the southern countries experiences. And lastly, I would like to ask a question about this ethical consideration about human rights, that considering the deep-rooted historical and structural power imbalances between the global North and global South, how can the international human rights framework evolve to respect the cultural sovereignty of southern nations while still ensuring accountability for violations? Should we move toward a more decentralized and pluralistic conception of human rights? And if so, what mechanisms would ensure that such a system does not become a vehicle for perpetuation of global inequality? Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you so very much, Nabib. Very great points. shared there, and also a very good question. We'll find time to answer it by the time we are finishing the session. But for now, let's open the floor to another discussant. Yusuf, are you there?
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be with you today. And I would just want to talk about an observation from a global south country. I believe that human rights, we should seek to find every human right and try to make it available for everyone. But I believe that the way to find a solution for human rights does not work the same way in global south as the global north, because in global south countries, I believe the youth, the person doesn't even know about his own human rights. So my observation or my question here, that how can we promote the human rights in the global south countries instead of finding solutions, while even the person doesn't even know the question, doesn't even know what is his own human rights. So thank you.
Thank you so very much, Yusuf, for bringing up the whole concept of sensitizing people in the global south on what human rights is, what their rights are, so that even by the time we're looking for solutions, they are aware of what we are talking about. Thank you so much for that. I will open the floor to the last discussant, Maria.
Thank you so much. It was incredible. I will try to be brief and really looking forward to some reactions from the speakers. While I was listening to the distinguished panelists, to the distinguished speakers, I realized that basically the conflict I have been studying for the last 10 years, this is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, started from 2014, is actually looks like a crossroads where we can find all the problems with both the fact of violation of human rights on the one hand, and all the problems with international reactions, even among the countries which were the source of human rights convention, human rights ideas as such, when this kind of impunity that Ingeborg was talking about is basically something which seems to be very far away from the moment we are really at. Speaking about this practical case and how we can find some really common ground to think about that there is no really that much that much difference between so-called North and so-called South. I will bring just here to the discussion couple of cases. When we are speaking about the human rights perspective, on the one hand, in the so-called North and in the global South, we tend to think that this is something which divides us, that there is a different approaches, that there are different standards. But on the other hand, if we look on a local perspective, how local people on the ground are suffering from the implications of the conflict, especially of the military international conflict, we will people are suffering basically on the same level the ground. For instance, probably one of the most vulnerable groups is the kids and children which are stayed in the territories in the conflict affected zones. Like in Ukraine, we have now about 19% of Ukrainian territory occupied by Russia, both Crimea, almost all the Donbass, part of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia region in the south of Ukraine. What is happening to the kids which were not brought anywhere from there by their parents, or who have lost parents, or kids who were found in orphanages? We are facing the huge, massive problem of deportation of the kids to the Russian Federation, which is prohibited by all the possible international humanitarian law standards, but there is little anyone in the West, in the global South, can do about that. And the number of kids which are being brought back to Ukraine in the result of negotiations, in particular with mediation of Qatar, is really very low in comparison to the real numbers. So basically, this is from Russian statistics that this is over 500,000 of kids which were relocated to Russia somehow. The Ukrainian numbers are really getting higher, but we are about like a couple of dozens of kids who were brought back. Those kids, this is who were staying in the temporarily occupied territories. We find out that their rights for education, their rights for the childhood without indoctrination and militarization are really violated. For instance, in Crimea, which is for the longest period under Russian control since 2014, there is only one Ukrainian school, and only less than 200 people, only less than 200 Ukrainian kids in Crimea have access to education in Ukrainian language, while before the 2014, before the annexation of Crimea, 100% of Ukrainian kids in Crimea had access to Ukrainian education, Ukrainian skills. So this is like the basic needs and the right of the people, the right of one of the most vulnerable groups, kids who are dependent on adults. We find that they became an instrument and a tool of one party in the war to assimilate and to wage basically the war. And the most important, the last but not least, is that we will have the consequences and implications of this for more decades to come. One of the biggest problems we're facing right now, when we're starting the case of Russia in Ukraine, basically, is that Russia is assimilating the local population by sending the people to Ukrainian temporarily occupied territories. And regardless of when and how Ukraine militarily or diplomatically will get its internationally recognized territory back, we will have a huge problem of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens who have no legal rights to reside there, be actually settled there, creating the problem for local communities for many decades to come. So I think we have much more to discuss with people, not only within the West, but with Global South altogether. And I'm completely open for any further discussions in the future, even beyond this conference as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Maria. And you have said it perfectly that we definitely cannot finish this conversation here. It has to keep going on. Thank you to all our discussants, Yusuf, Nabib, Maria, and Professor Veseline. We are now supposed to be winding up. We have less than 5 minutes here. And I'd like to wind up with Sandra Freeman. And maybe in less than 2 minutes, just share with us your organization. You work with the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. Please tell us what you're trying to do to fill in the gaps when it comes to, supporting the human rights for the Indigenous community. And if you can touch on Yusuf's question on how we can make sure that people in the Global South, Indigenous communities as well, are aware of what these human rights are so that they're part of the conversation from the very beginning. Sandra, I'll give this to you. Please give us an answer to that. Maybe try to take less than 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd like to add on what Yusuf said. Yes, individuals sometimes don't know what their human rights are, but all of those who are in any sort of violation or what's happening, they have resilience. So that resilience then gives them their rights to continually fight on. But Indigenous Peoples Rights International, what we do is we advocate, we hold conferences, we have already this year, we had 67 cases that we have supported through the legal system. That's in Africa, that's in Latin America, that's in Asia, and also other places around the globe. We also work with urgent relocating people, securing their safety. But the other thing on top of that is that individuals, as all of us know what our rights are deep down. And for us, we try and advocate. We have been to the United Nations. We go to Emirates to advocate to the Human Rights Council about our rights as Indigenous people and as human rights defenders to our cultural rights. And I think that all of us together here, sitting here, all of us come where we've all got the recipe for what human rights is around the globe for individuals, everybody. And I always say, put us all together and we're like a cake. Flour, milk, sugar, all of us are rising, regardless of whatever our rights are. There will be battles, there will be wars, but we will continually keep standing for our rights, who we are as a human being, and that's what we do in IPRI. We continually stand globally with Indigenous peoples. We have to seek donations continually to fight in legal battles, and we have to seek donations for the security of secure the rights of people. And I'd like to thank you all very much. I think it's such an honour to bring to the table and to the Be voice. All of us are a voice for the invisible, or those who cannot even be at the table, to talk about rights globally around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Sandra. And allow me at this particular moment to thank everyone. We have come to the end of our third session of the Global Town Hall 2024, where our conversation was on the promise of universality, how to promote and protect human rights. Thank you so very much to our speakers, Irene J. Liu, who is the Regional Director, Asia and Pacific at the International Fund for the Public Interest Media. Thank you so much also, Ingeborg Moore, who is the Executive Director of Norwegian Human Rights Fund. Thank you, Sandra Kremer, who is the Chair of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. And finally, thank you, Olivia Ndole, who is the Public Interest Environmental Lawyer. A very big thanks, of course, to also our discussants, Yusuf Nabib, Maria, and Professor Veselin, for your contribution to this conversation. It has made it very impactful for every single one of us. And finally, a very big thanks to Global Citizen and Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia for making this global town hall happen. It's been an absolute pleasure being your host. My name is Violet Ngina, a television presenter from Kenya, and I'm most definitely looking forward to continuing with these conversations even after this town hall. Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you, Heather. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in and participating in the session, the largest voting year in history, what is wrong with democracy, what is right, and what is right with democracy. Up next, we'll discuss in a session titled Eyes on Palestine. Apologies. Ladies and gentlemen, our fourth session is titled The Largest Voting Year in History, What is Wrong with Democracy, What is Right with Democracy. Before we begin, let us hear a keynote speech from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia, Senator the Honorable Penny Wong. You may have the screen.
Warm greetings from the International Peace Bureau to the Global Town Hall 2024